Testing. Can anyone hear me? My name is Toby, and I'm the host of the Secret Transmission Podcast. We are a show that discusses the paranormal, conspiracies, the supernatural, UFOs, cryptozoology, and anything else weird. Our show is transmitted to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube. You can also follow us on Twitter for updates at Secret Transpod. So get ready to put on your tinfoil hats and come learn with us as we try to explain the unexplainable.
Greetings, comrades, and today we're on the special episode about dead Lenins. I would have named this Dead Kennedys, but it's Lenin that we're talking about. At any rate, this episode is going to tell you the crazy story about what happened with Lenin after he died. He also became an icon of the Soviet people and its government throughout his death, but it changed meanings, and that stunned me the most. The interesting part is how all these meanings changed, and how it all began, and what it meant later on, and what is going on today in Russia about Lenin's body, and what discussions people are having. Now, I do have to say the first part is much more organized and interesting than the latter one, because as it turns out, there's not much going on with Lenin in the 60s and 70s and 80s. The interesting part is actually concentrated in the very beginning in the SNEP era, and then after Perestroika in modern day, with some crazy prophecies and weird stories going on. But that allowed me to once again return to my roots and, give you some Soviet anecdotes, political ones about all the zeitgeist here. And I'm sorry about some weird pronunciation there is the latter part, because we have a racetrack right next to our home and they started doing crazy things, so I couldn't do another retake of the last part of this episode. Now, before we get to Lenin, there's another person that we have to mention up first, I think. Let's talk about Nikolai Ivanovich Pirogov. He is considered to be the founder of field surgery and one of the very first surgeons that used anesthetics. He was also the first surgeon to use anesthesia in a field operation in 1847 during the Crimean War. Also, being a specialist on treating various traumas and fractures, he invented his own brand new methods, and thus, he's one of the most widely recognized Russian physicians. But we actually care about what happened when he died. See, he died in 1881 in Vinnytsia, which is now modern Ukraine, when Lenin was just 10 years old. The interesting thing is that his wife decided to preserve his body for the next generations to see his likeness. So Pirogov's body is preserved and rests in the church in the city where he died, Vinnytsia. He himself invented and created many of the embalming techniques that were used on his corpse, and later on that of Lenin's. In January 1924, Lenin died and was moved to Moscow from Gorky in a special funeral train. It arrived on the 23rd of January and carried Lenin's body in the cargo cart number 1691. It was a special train because this was Lenin's official train, personal train, with a designation number U-127. Official and designated, that was just specifically made for him. And he had been made its honorary elder machinist about 8 months before his death. Of course, it was operated by a specifically assigned and vetted crew from the Moscow depot. Dzerzhinsky was responsible for this. Now, as the body arrived, nobody had at this time any idea on what to do with it. The important thing was to ensure that everyone could say goodbye to the great leader of the revolution. Stalin himself personally led the funeral arrangements, ensuring that he maintained a high profile. He acted as the lead pallbearer and was the chief mourner. He lay in this state of nobody knowing what to do with him for 4 days in Moscow's House of Unions, during which time almost 1 million mourners paid their respects from all parts of the USSR, and there were people informing the Soviets that there are foreign delegations incoming as well. Trotsky, Stalin's rival for power, who was recovering from illness near the Black Sea, missed the funeral, having been told the wrong date by the scheming Stalin. But these foreign visits and the whole mass of people caused huge problems for the Soviet government. You see, it was minus 40 degrees outside at the time of his death. And minus 40 is, luckily enough, where Fahrenheit and Celsius comes together, so everyone can understand this. The body was frozen solid. Inside the Moscow's House of Unions, it was a bit warmer. Only minus 16 degrees Celsius. And they had brought in specific palm trees and other decorations just to, make sure the room wasn't as gloomy, even though I have no idea why palm trees should need to be brought in for Lenin, but they did so. It was cool at the time. Hey, it's 20s. But even everything they had brought in was completely frozen. And imagine this, 1 million people just coming towards this House of Unions and paying their respects while it's minus 16 Celsius, which is ridiculously cold. So, while this whole thing lasted, while these 4 days lasted, there were no issues. But, with the visits and people coming in and everything, which according to the plans would continue for about 2 months, the Soviets had to somehow extend the period of Lenin's corpse being preserved, and, they had to create a mausoleum for him where people could see him, and this caused issues. Firstly, it was decided to build a temporary wooden tomb in the Red Square, while a proper mausoleum would be built, and, while people would decide what would be going on there. Architect Alexei Shushev was charged with building a structure suitable for viewing of the body by mourners, and it was ready pretty soon. As it was very cold outside, the temporary preservation work wasn't very difficult. Yuri Lopukhin, who was the leader of the mausoleum group since 1951, up until his retirement in the 80s, states, quote, when he was placed in the coffin, it was kinda like his funeral already. However, there were simply too many people who wanted to say farewell to Lenin. There were delegations from all the regions and the foreign ones too. And so it was necessary to somehow place his coffin in a place where people could visit him, and it was needed to preserve him. For a while. In the beginning, there were no thoughts that this would go on forever. And by the way, due to this, as they thought at the time, temporary nature of things, and then there's this joke that nothing is more permanent than temporary things. After the decision to preserve the body was made later on, Lenin's brain was removed and kept in formaldehyde for 2 years, before being sliced into 30,963 wafer-thin slices to be studied and examined in minute detail to work out exactly how the brain of this genius worked. And this is just a foreshadowing of the mad science that's incoming here. And about mad science, this was the NEP era, the new economic policy which we talked about last episode. This was the brand spanking new Soviet Union. Not the old rustic kind. This was the triumph of the communists. The prosperity of the country had slowly returned. Well, sort of, but officially it had. But more importantly, this was a period of ideological victories for the USSR. Lenin died during the period where Bolsheviks felt like they were winning. Felt like man could conquer nature, felt like their ideology reigned supreme. They were like in complete control and man could march forwards. But all of this was just in this structural nature, you see. This was all about, we had won in the political sphere, our ideology reigns supreme, we are quickly advancing and catching up to the capitalist nations and we shall overcome them in world revolution and yada yada yada. But the nature goes its course, doesn't it? So, while this temporary preservation was going on, it slowly took on an ideological character. Now, first off, there were Soviet scientists who thought about this whole thing and declared that, as communists had won in this political country, they had acquired this major victory and their economy was recovering and everything, they must also conquer nature. And as science marches on, they looked on at what could already be done at the time, such as, mind you, sex change operations, theoretical by this point, but seriously, they really mention sex change operations, which is weird for very conservative Soviet Union, but these were looked at as a major victory over nature by the Soviet scientists. See, they at this point thought that, it doesn't matter about sex change, whatever, we beat nature, we are awesome. And they thought, they were very optimistic about their capabilities in the future in comparison with the past. Other scientists had done crazy things, and they just thought that, actually believed that, and declared this, that it might be very possible that in a few decades, proper resurrection would be available, probably only to the great leaders of the time, but even further on, to everyone. And so it was recommended to the Politburo that Lenin should be put in a deep freeze. And this, obviously, appealed to the communist leaders for ideological reasons. whether later resurrection would be real or not. Not even kidding here, and I know that this sounds like science fiction, but remember that this is Lysenko's and Pavlov's era of mad Soviet science. Listen to our April the 1st episode. At this point, this wasn't even the craziest thing that the USSR was working on. I mean, we are talking human-monkey hybrids for armies. We are talking about making sure there are two heads on one dog and experimenting with crazy things with just on the surgical and genetical levels. This is the period of utter craziness. So at this point, they thought that this whole thing is going to work and they might resurrect him one day. And it was kind of crazy. Secondly, there was another symbolic meaning to this whole Lenin's death thing. Historian Nina Tumarkin writes, quote, "The sadness that overtook everyone following Lenin's death was, for the most part, caused by other circumstances. Saying farewell to the dead Lenin in Moscow and the mourning ceremonies in other cities, without doubt, was also a moment of strange catharsis to the people, who at the time had survived through a multitude of horrors: war, revolution, civil unrest, starvation, epidemics. Lenin's death became the reason for the first national common ritual of mourning after all these hardships, and in part was a way to mourn their own personal tragedies. The society was overtaken by hysterical sorrow, by an open desire for everyone to go and grieve about the dead Lenin, in a way now being finally able to grieve about themselves. The massive Lenin's cult that was spreading around the cities and the countryside in 1924 had a goal to allow the people to cry it out, to acquire some peace for themselves. And as such, it was encouraged by the government, as these feelings of grief about Lenin's death were similar to the feelings held in general by the Soviet population at the time. And if people acquired some peace for themselves, it only increased the state's stability. At the same time, during the February thaw, because this body stayed in this temporary holding for at least 6 weeks, where more millions of people visited it, the body had started to show signs of decomposition, with gray and black spots starting to appear. First, they just couldn't keep him in a freezer for an extended period of time. Moscow and the USSR in general had huge issues with power outages at the time. That could last for days. And with the power needed for such a freezer, it would not be possible to ensure that everything would go smoothly with the body. Not that they didn't try, though. So a risky decision was made to embalm and preserve the body, according to the latest inventions of science, and using the studies of our earlier mentioned Dr. Pigorov specifically. But yeah, this whole freeze, no wait, let's make him a mummy thing deserves more explanation. So, here's what happened in glorious detail from an amazing source in Как умер Ленин. Откровения смотрителя Мавзолея, or How Lenin Died. Mausoleum Gardens Relations, by a previously mentioned leader of the whole thing, Yuri Lopukhin. So, as Lopukhin informs us, after Lenin's death, there was a decision to temporarily embalm his body in the beginning. For the temporary embalming and freezement, as it was called, as it got combined with the low temperatures, they used a standard solution of formalin, zinc chloride, spirits, glycerine, and water. They opened the chest cavity and took his ribs out, putting in the conservation liquid through the aorta with a special high-pressure needle. As the doctors of the era report, this helped Lenin to regain his natural coloring and eliminated some of the spots that had started to appear. This was about the same time as the wooden tomb was built, and no less than Stalin, Molotov, Kalinin, and Dzerzhinsky carried Lenin's coffin inside the tomb. Imagine that, the whole big league players of the USSR at the time. Notice the absence of Trotsky, however. Another weird and kinda sweet moment is that Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, will write on the 28th of January 1924 a letter dedicated to, guess what, Ines Armand, who was also deceased by now, I have to remind you, Lenin's lover. And yes, I know that's super weird, but honestly, these are Bolsheviks we're talking about here. Anyhow, Krupskaya writes, quote, "Loved one, native mine, Innochka. Yesterday we buried Vladimir Ilyich. He wandered around for the last time. Just recently, on Sunday, we worked with him. I read him about the party meeting at the Soviet conference. The doctors didn't await death at all, and didn't even believe it when the agony started. They also said that he was unconscious during the whole ordeal, but by now, I know for sure that doctors don't understand the thing. So that apparently was normal and happened. But yeah. Lenin's body was in the cold tomb in a state like this for a long while, until at the very end of March, 56 days after his death, finally a decision was made to preserve and embalm him. This comes from my source, so I'll just add there that it was for political and ideological expediency mostly. First mention about the long-term preservation of Lenin's body was made on the 28th of January by an engineer Krasin, who was at the time of the People's Commissar of Internal Trade. His idea was accepted, and already on the 30th of January, in the meeting of the created subcommission on what to do with Lenin, Professor of Anatomy, Deshin, and another professor, Abrikosov, were ordered to conduct experiments with freezing corpses who had been previously treated with the same conservation liquid that Lenin had been treated with. In the 4th of February 1924, for, quote, looking at the most important problems which necessitate a quick and decisive decision-making and constant supervision, a special troika was created, consisting of Molotov, Kassin, and one other guy whom I won't really bother you with. This is the literally only thing he appeared in, Bonch Brushev. Now, these guys were supposed to decide what to do with Lenin's corpse further on. So, this troika, under the lead of Molotov, basically decided to buy all the necessary freezing equipment in Germany and assigned people to work on this project, and under pain of death, commanded both of our professors to start experimenting with freezing bodies and to report on their successes. This experimentation, by the way, would go on to modern day. Up until today, as the Lenin's body is constantly being washed twice a week on Mondays and Fridays at 10 a.m. exactly, the people just come in and wash the body, and they have special corpses being preserved from 1924 up until this time in the exact same conditions as Lenin is. So this tradition of just, grabbing quote-unquote volunteer corpses was getting on there. So yeah, these guys had been tasked to observe the condition of the body before as well, but now this was getting really serious. And by the way, reports were extremely, reasonable. They account the condition of various spots on the body and its coloring and literally everything imaginable by hours. And so, this went on until the 21st of February, when, by the way, all the preparation work for Lenin being frozen was completed. Now, about the spots there, one interesting fact is that as color photography didn't exist in the USSR at the time, the government tasked a special artist to paint exactly the color of the skin of various Lenin's body parts and the spots that had appeared on there on paper sheets, so that everything could be recorded and later restored. And these were signed by the Politburo members and lead officials of the Cheka by this point, and he had to do it exactly, or, gulag. Gulag or shooting, things that just happen. And by the way, these things are kept in special files to this day. But on this 21st of February, the unexpected happened. All the labor and efforts of Krasov, the engineering group, and the experiments of Deshin and Abrikosov were just thrown out the window, and the deep freeze project was cancelled. Why? Well, like I mentioned before, because of the simple reason of the power outages in Moscow. It was quickly calculated that a massive freezer that would keep Lenin deep frozen just would not happen with the technology of the time. It basically needed the factory of its own to operate. And Moscow, well, no city, in fact, in the USSR could be able to support it efficiently, especially with the flimsy power of the situation back then. This is a tendency in the USSR in general, as you might have noticed from my show, for them to make huge projects, and only when they're almost done, to test if they're actually viable. And thus, huge resources are lost all the time, but hey, not that we care about such meager things. And at the same time, two different scientists, students of the previously mentioned Pigorov, appeared on the scene. One of them was Vladimir Petrovich Vorobyov, and the other one was Boris Ilyich Zbarsky. And they were persuaded, with hard methods, to keep Lenin's corpse intact without freezing because they had the know-how, as they were both anatomy professors. See, what was important was that they both had their sins against the Soviet Empire. For starters, they both were from the lesser nobility, of Jewish origin, rich city dwellers. They were bourgeoisie class people. Sort of the people Lenin used to shoot in public and take all their stuff away, But that just wasn't even enough of this. See, while they were working in the Kharkov University Anatomy Cathedra during the Civil War, they had investigated some very violent murders of white royalist officers. And as then, who controlled Kharkov changed very often, basically they just wrote an honest answer, which was one of their biggest mistakes, stating that the Reds were responsible for brutally murdering white army officer POWs, and that they had looted them, and that they had desecrated the corpses too. But that wasn't their biggest mistake. Their biggest mistake was that they had signed this statement themselves. And when the Soviets won, this didn't look good at all. So, they ran away for a while. They ran away to some random countryside, also in the Ukraine. But, when this time came around, they were kindly persuaded by our good old friends in Cheka to, trading in not being shot on the spot and their families not being sent to Gulag for making sure that their brand new, crazy at the time, unheard of, project of preserving bodies in a lifelike condition without freezing would work out on Lenin. And, then they would not get shot. Or sent to Gulag, which they would totally be, with direct threats, if they would fail. And by the way, this atmosphere of dread carried on throughout the whole Soviet era. And the people working in these labs were extremely secretive, never writing down what they did or sharing it with the outside world. Because the people working in there, for all the posterity, while the Soviet power existed, knew so much, and they really were thinking about how intelligence was treated there, so they wanted to figure out a way how to be kept irreplaceable. And even though the solution that preserved Lenin's body was mostly glycerine and water and other quite simple things, it was brought on to the powers that be as very super high-tech and extremely complicated. So that, they just couldn't be replaced, or shot, or, working on such useful project, knowing something that nobody else did, really kept you alive and prosperous and in high positions and, wealthy and well-off during the Soviet era. But I'm running a bit ahead of myself. At any rate, all this is just one of the theories and stories on how Lenin got embalmed in the first place. A second one, as reported by no less than Trotsky, who wasn't even informed about the moving of Lenin's body to the tomb and was being actively pushed out of power by our good old buddy Stalin at the time. Yeah, this is a bit stranger. See, he wrote about a meeting of the Politburo in autumn 1923, where Stalin declared that there's a possibility that, quote, some fine comrades from the provinces, end quote, would embalm Lenin in case of his death. Trotsky writes the following, quote, when Comrade Stalin finished his speech, only then it became clear to me where these, in the beginning, weird and incomprehensible winks and nudges and ideas were going. He said that Lenin was a Russian person and that he needs to be buried like a Russian. Now, being buried like a Russian, according to the canons of the Russian Orthodox Church, means that, the saints became relics, and there was obviously the idea of Lenin's importance and him being worshipped by the people. And apparently to us, the party of revolutionary Marxism, the right way of action that's being suggested here by Stalin is going in the same direction. To preserve Lenin's body. Previously, there were relics of Sergei Rabozhenskov and Serafim Savroskoy, and now they want to replace them with relics of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. I would totally want to know who are these comrades from the provinces which, according to Stalin, will, with the help of modern science, embalm the remains of Lenin and thus create a relic from them. I'd say that they have nothing in common with the science of Marxism. End quote. Now, it has to be noted that Trotsky wrote this letter after Lenin's embalming, but it's still one of the major opinions out there. There are also other important historians that correspond to this occultization of Lenin idea by Stalin. The idea is that Stalin wanted to recreate a historical paradigm, giving the people a czar in the person of himself, and a new god to worship in the person of Lenin. Bukharin, which we mentioned in previous episode, the NEP supporter and Stalin's ally at the time, wrote in an open letter that, quote, "We, instead of icons, are now worshipping leaders and persons, and they are trying to create relics of Lenin and communist sauce for the proletariat and the masses." And according to sources, in 1946, Stalin has apparently said to Professor Molachov, who was among others working in the group tasked with his own biography, he said to him that, quote, "Marxism is a class religion. What we say is law is mandatory to the people. What we say becomes a symbol of faith to them." End quote. Hey, and these are Stalin's words, not mine, and Stalin will be later really much criticized by the personal cult that he created. But we'll get to this in future episodes, but this is where this begins, I think. Also, and this was going on in the streets because rumors from the time are just crazy. Another popular opinion going around in said rumors was that one of the reasons of Lenin's embalming was actually to prevent any pretenders from rising. Here we can draw some relevance and some analogy to what happened before during the time of troubles in Russian history. There were rumors among the people that Lenin had tried to escape from Kremlin and wanted to apologize in front of all the people for all of this communist mess. But, however, was stopped by the Stalin-appointed guards in Gorky and isolated there, and now was just being presented as dead. But there were also other rumors. I'm just discounting these which just state that Trotsky poisoned him, or that Jews poisoned him, which involves Trotsky because he was Jewish and anti-Semitism is on the rise in the Soviet Union in this era. Yeah, there were, of course, as soon as something happened, the Jews did it, even in the USSR. But these were just, all around rumors. But there were some interesting rumors which were in specific areas. For example, in the Moscow area, people mostly rumored that Lenin had actually died 6 months ago, and that he had been kept frozen for all this time because of Politburo being afraid of revolts that might happen if the people would find out. In the Irkutsk region, people spoke that Lenin was actually alive and had fled the country together with Trotsky, and that this whole death thing was a cover-up because the communists had massacred the protest action by the unemployed, and that at the same time a pogrom against Jews had happened, and this needed to be toned down. In Byelorussia, in Minsk, people rumored that Lenin was assassinated not by Trotsky or Jews, no, by the Poles and Pilsudski, and that a new war with them is coming soon, as Pilsudski knew that all the communist power rested upon Lenin's shoulders, and that he would use this to crush Soviet authority. And that obviously Trotsky had been arrested with his allies, while carrying huge amounts of Tsarist gold, which he had stolen as a part of massive Jewish conspiracy. See, when something like this happens, the whole nation goes crazy, and it's always the Jews to blame. Even in the Soviet Union, it's, I think it's kind of a historical thing by this point, but the more rumors you read, the crazier it gets. So this is how the embalming project began. But what happened later? Oh, it's just as grand as this.
Hi, this is Alice, who would like to say a great thank you to our new patrons, comrades Jonathan and David. Thank you very much. For anyone who wants to join our Patreon, you can find us at patreon.com/theeasternborder. People who are our patrons receive all sorts of goodies, including Anna Politkovskaya's book, A Russian Diary. The newest part of the book has also been released today, and all our supporters have access to it. So we really hope you enjoy it. And now, back to the show.
During World War II, the body was removed from the mausoleum in October 1941 and evacuated to Tyumen in Siberia, when it appeared that Moscow might be in danger of capture by German troops. Of course, it was moved by a top-secret train and guarded by especially selected soldiers, who had no idea, for the most part, who were there moving around. And no one in the town of Tyumen also had any idea, because once the troops had moved this object, as they only knew it was, then they had been just sent away. And special NKVD, later KGB, previously Cheka, soldiers were sent in to guard it. It was kept in a specific mansion in Tyumen from the old style of mansions, pre-Civil War ones, pre-revolution ones, a huge mansion of the local lesser nobility. This mansion was, all the windows were just bricked closed, and the whole mansion was just instantly covered around with brick walls and fences and everything, and a massive top-secret guard was placed there. The soldiers who had been placed to defend this body and to look after it, and to watch over the scientists to make sure they do not screw up anything, they were specifically excused from going onto the front lines. There are reports that they also kind of often complained about the quality of the food which they received there in Tyumen, which the locals, by the way, did not understand, because even though the quality of food that they got was way worse than in the Kremlin's own cafeteria, for the local girls, these soldiers were basically the idols, and there are many reports about this, because they had white bread. I mean, you know, the wheat bread that you put on toast. Previously, the Soviet bread was just this gray brick-like substance, and they had meat. They had preserved meat in these conserved cans of things. They had that, and they also sometimes had some wine, even. So yeah, they complained about the quality of the food, but for locals during the wartime, it was exquisite thing. And, you know, the scientists who were working there, they were under immense, massive pressure because the bath with Lenin's body inside this preserving embalming liquid was placed on the second floor of this mansion, with all the windows, by the way, being just bricked closed, with stones and everything. But yeah, they had the best service the state could offer. Once, when they ran out of distilled water from which to make this embalming liquid, it got specifically delivered to them from Omsk with a plane on the very same day. Preservation of Lenin's corpse by this point was a matter of extreme importance, and this also lends some credibility to the claims that they basically made a relic out of it. As, you know, he was worshipped with like almost a godlike reverence by this point. It will only be a bit later, just, you know, in the 40s they start to appear, but it would basically be only after World War II when political jokes about Lenin would start to appear. Previously it was kind of, you know, a true reverence about all the situation there. It was like, in 1936, for one, before the war, when we speak about this reverence, there was a letter by a factory worker from Nizhny Novgorod, who wrote to the newspaper Pravda about his visit to the mausoleum, and he wrote, quote, "Well, you know, these times are hard, and we're enduring a lot of hardships, and there's not, everything is just kind of not okay, but whenever you kind of start to think about how the government could be doing things better, and whenever you want to complain, then you just go to Moscow and stand by Lenin's tomb for a while, and everything just falls into your place, and you just want to keep being completely loyal subject and a comrade to everyone." Yeah. But yeah, during World War II, these guys were kind of complaining about boredom while guarding Lenin's corpse, well, instead of being sent to the front lines. And this is kind of weird, but yeah, he sat there in Tyumen for 4 years after, of course, being returned to the mausoleum in Kremlin, and his tomb was reopened again to the public. Now, when Stalin died, he was also placed in this tomb in the same way as Lenin from 1953 to 1961, but he was then later removed as part of Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist acts. At the same time, there were also many other, you know, leaders from the foreign-friendly countries who thought, you know, we had to do everything like the Soviet Union, so let's have embalming for ourselves. Something similar was about to happen in Hungary, but that didn't last long. Tito in Yugoslavia later, as a listener of mine reported in, he wasn't a fan of becoming a mummy, but he had this special mega-exclusive tomb to which people went on pilgrimage, and thanks for that piece of information. But yeah, this cult of, you know, having your first leader being in a tomb, being observable and being preserved, that kind of went on and was a fad for a moment. Oh, it's still, by the way, going on in North Korea. There, Kim Il-sung is still being preserved there, and of course Lenin's tomb and his mausoleum in Russia. But yeah, this super secrecy just increased and got even more stronger than before during the Stalin's increasingly despotic reign. Because if previously during the NEP era you could be a bit more free and there was some freedom of the press, then now it got really crazy under Stalin. But Stalin died and passed away, and then we enter the Brezhnev's era of Lenin and his mausoleum. Now, truth to be told, after World War II and Stalin's death, the whole story kind of gets a bit more boring. It's not as crazy as before, but it's fun at the same time, because you see, after Stalin's era, Khrushchev took power, and later on, even though the newly built mausoleum, which was grand and what you can see today if you visit Moscow, was extremely important on the official level and became a major tourism object and guarded with reverence by the Soviet authorities and used in all the parades, and pioneers had to go there and place flowers there, that's a story of a different era. I wanted to focus on this early period here, but the whole cult of Lenin by this point had become kind of silly and laughed at. Now, obviously not in the open, but there were a ton of political anecdotes at this time about the whole thing. And sadly, that was the most interesting part about all these situations. The people who worked there just went their own way, doing their thing, not being shot, and the interviews with them are kind of disappointing, going into minute details about the secrecy and how they pull Lenin from a bathtub and then experiment on these other corpses and then watch them. But that's not that interesting, and it's not what this show is all about. This show is all about the cultural phenomenon which were explicitly clear in the first part. And what becomes clear in the second part is how this mausoleum became another part of this culture. Remember, it was the reverence and the way of nature of people grieving, right? Well, now there were slogans like Lenin lives eternally. These were spewed everywhere. But as the people from the revolutionary era got older, and this memory was lost over time, the government had to polish up this personality cult of Lenin because the state needed its own relics, its own version of religion. So they started to bring out people who had met Lenin while he was still alive and use them as important figures of history, propping them up and making them tell various stories, and it got published everywhere, and they went on to congresses and give lectures, and it happened even if they literally had nothing to do with the whole thing. Now, there was the famous painting in the Soviet Union where Lenin was basically working in one of these sudebniks, because Lenin in his era had instituted these Saturday work-alongs, essentially, where everyone, even though Saturday was a day off, Saturday was a holiday, people were invited, basically forced to volunteer to go into these sudebniks and just, do extra work for the country, help bring country together. And in one of these events, there's a picture of Lenin carrying a huge log, and there's another guy whose face we can't see in the background who's helping Lenin carry this log, who's carrying the log with him. They basically, at the end of this, there were about at least 10,000 or more. There were tons of people who claimed to be the guys with whom Lenin carried the log, which became a joke in itself. But this wasn't the only type of joke that was going on, because Lenin reverence from serious grief and a way of catharsis and expressing themselves for the people really became a joke, just like everything in the Soviet Union. When something is taken to the extremes, the Soviet people just make fun of it, really, and here are some picked by me, because one of the stories is like this: a man returns home and he enters the room and finds out that his wife is there with a lover, and he's just kind of preparing to beat him up and just being very, very, very crazy, and the wife just screams at him, hey, don't you dare beat him, he saw Lenin alive. Yeah, it was about this level of reverence. And there's another one. Year 1917. Lenin goes to a public bath. There are no free spots there. Not far from him, a proletariat person is sitting there. And he's on this one chair. He's sitting on one kind of this stool there. And he's putting his legs up on the other one and kind of, steaming his feet. And Lenin just goes and talks with him. Comrade, could you please lend me a stool here? Go to hell. Lenin goes back a bit, is kind of freaked out and weirded, and doesn't find another stool, and goes back to the comrade and says, "Comrade, well, this is not communistical. You have 2 stools, and I don't have a single one." And the comrade replies, "Well, go to hell. Just get lost, or I'm just gonna smack you with this stool on the head if you don't get lost." 50 years later, the chairman of a meeting. And now, before you, with his memories, stands an old working person who not once, but twice spoke with Lenin. So, this was the weird stuff, and all of this was kind of crazy. And again, there were also some jokes about Inessa Armand and Krupskaya later on as well, because in 1975 a memorial plaque is being revealed in a house in Moscow. In this house in 1910, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin hid together with Inessa Armand from Nadezhda Krupskaya, who was looking for them. And all that thing. And about the log, by the way. Another joke, and again, these all come from Odessa, and thus involve a lot of Jews. Don't hate me for this. I've explained how this Ashkenazi humor phenomenon previously, but here's one. What types of Pascha are there? Well, there are exactly 3. There's the Jewish one, about the memory of how the Jews left Egypt. There's the Christian one, about in the memory on how Jesus Christ resurrected, and then there's the Soviet one, in the memory of how Lenin carried the log. So yeah, and there's another, and I'm really sorry, but honestly, I worked real hard on this. And these jokes are, again, another memory of the zeitgeist of the era, and we'll get into more of this later on when we come to modern day, but one of my favorites is like, kids, today we're going to theater. We're gonna look at the spectacle Living Dead. And Vovochka from the back row replies, I'm getting tired of all of this. All about Lenin everywhere, nothing but Lenin. And yeah, talking about how the future was viewed. Another one was like, there were a lot of jokes about in the 60s and 70s about how the year 2000 would look if we would have waited in communism, and here's one of those, another one nice examples of all the situation. Year 2000, the loudspeaker in the metro is speaking. Station in the name of Lenin. The next stop will be station in the name of Lenin. There are crossings to the station, to the line of the name of Lenin, and to the other line in the name of Lenin. Because, this whole thing just went out everywhere. But yeah, the final joke, because these really got popular at the same time where the mass immigration to Israel was happening, was this one. Lenin resurrects, and he just instantly goes to drink beer with the proletariat. The working men are just standing there, drinking their beers, and not even paying any attention to the great leader. And Lenin just confused and asks, "What, comrades, didn't you, recognize me?" And they look at him and say, Vanka, look at this guy. He's the dude from the 10 ruble banknote. And okay, and this'll be the final one. I promise. Old Bolshevik on this meeting goes and is sharing his memories about the great leader Lenin. Well, this happened on the second meeting of the party. I go to the bathroom and our great leader is just, standing there on the sidelines, and he's just pissing pissing there. But I look at him, but his eyes are so large and kind. I remember him like this forever. But yeah, I'm sorry for this less formal part of the situation, but honestly speaking, yeah, this is what my dad used to tell me about Lenin himself, and this is how he is literally engraved in the later generations of the Soviet Union. Because if in the beginning everyone was afraid of Stalin, then yeah, you can kind of observe the shifts of the mood from more serious and kind of expressing your grief through all this situation to this very common to us Soviet folks political jokes about literally whatever. So yeah, and so came the perestroika, and with that things changed yet again. And so Lenin managed to kind of live through the perestroika with quite ease. There were no major discussions about that situation, but except there's one discussion at the beginning, where the first discussion started about, what to do with Lenin. In the May 1989, a director, Mark Zakharov, who literally spoke at the popular TV show A Look, or Vzгляд, he basically stated that, maybe Lenin should be kind of really, laid to rest in the Volkovsk cemetery in Leningrad, or now St. Petersburg, next to his mother. But that was about it. He managed to live through all this situation, but things became interesting again. Interesting in the sense that there's more to tell you than jokes, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the 1991, some political parties and a lot of these people up there in the Russian government, they started to kind of bring forth some discussion about how really Lenin should be taken out of the mausoleum, and how they really should be kind of brought out of how his remains should be brought out of the mausoleum and buried together with his brain. Like I mentioned before, brain was basically kept in a specific institute of Lenin's brains, where it was kept there with like all these tens of thousands of these little samples of his brain, which were previously been examined throughout the Soviet era. And these results, I couldn't find them even in Russian archives. They're still secret, so we don't exactly know what was going on in Lenin's head by this point. And mostly, these ideas were basically stated by Anatoly Sobchak, which was the mayor of St. Petersburg at the time, and Yuri Lushkov, which was the mayor of Moscow at this time. At the spring of 1987, the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, also stated his opinion about, how Lenin's body needed to be really buried. But this caused kind of a turmoil in the society at this time. In the April 1987, the Gosduma, the most of which were back then communists, basically created a special statement about all this presidential initiative, which said, in part, the following. The statement of Boris Yeltsin is completely useless. According to the Constitution of Russian Federation, the decision about moving the body is not included in what the president can do. First of all, the decision of putting him there was made by the Russian government, the Soviet government at the time, in the second Congress of the Soviets in the 26th of January 1924, and it was not made by the executive branch of the government. And they really kind of declaring that the decision was not made by Stalin, but instead by the people. And secondly, that this mausoleum of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is kind of this, is a part of the unique ensemble of the Red Square and cannot be removed from it because it has been included in the UNESCO Cultural Heritage as a monument. Now, this is kind of interesting because nobody's speaking about demolishing the mausoleum. It's just that, about moving the Lenin's remains there. So, this never happened in the Yeltsin's era. And Vladimir Putin also said when he came to power in 2001 that he thought that moving Lenin's body was not timely at this point. He said in 2001, when I shall see that a complete majority of the people will want this, then we can start discussing about all of this situation. While I don't see this, it is not discussed. Now, I do have to mention that since 1981, the state takes very little care of Lenin. Basically, the whole institute surrounded around this preservation, and they're by this point the leading experts of preservation of and embalming of bodies. They're turned into a private enterprise, and they do private embalming services right now. In the 90s, they did so for the leaders of organized crime and for some private businessmen, which were tied together. Right now, it's mostly for foreign dignitaries, mind you. They get a lot of requests from foreign countries, and they also get some from a rich businessman. And so they do these deals where where you can hire the guys who take care of Lenin, and they will make sure that your relative's dead body is preserved so that it would look really nice on the funeral. And they kind of agree to preserve a body for no longer than a month before everyone can arrive to said funeral, so that, you know, the body would endure if the funeral needs to be done later on. Then this is interesting because by now they completely refuse to do anything longer than a month for anyone else who's not Lenin, because according to some interviews with these folks, they don't really consider this to be a moral decision. But still, this is going on, and they're a private enterprise, and they get donations. So the Russian state really, well, they give some amounts of money, but it isn't as funded as it was before, where literally whole institutes and scientific offices and a bunch of money went into this project. But yeah, Mr. Putin stated that, you know, this would happen if basically a majority of the people would want it. And recently, the very, very recent thing which happened about the situation was in, like a few months ago, last month actually, in the April 2017, where a bunch of deputies from the Communist Party, which is like a liberal democratic party, which is communist because Mr. Zhirinovsky is there, and of course United Russia, the Putin's party, they kind of wanted to introduce into Gosduma a project of a law about transferring Lenin's body. The project kind of looks to change the law about this whole Lenin's deal, goes on to specify how exactly it would be done and everything. But right now, Putin has stated that, you know, it is still, again, too early to speak about making sure that Lenin actually is buried properly in the ground, even though Orthodox Church of Russia has stated many, many times before that, you know, it should be really done. And, you know, at this point, how Russia thinks is that about 60% of Russian population are, in principle, agreeing with the fact that Lenin should really be buried in the ground. Either right now, which is 36%, are for it, or when the final people whom really Lenin matters a lot would pass away, then it should be done, and such people are 24% of Russians. But there are still kind of rumors going around about this era. And a site which is dedicated to astrology, no less, and the occult in modern-day Russia, heavily criticizes this whole decision. Because all of the situation, the fact that, you know, from one part, they are really, really annoyed to the fact that in the heart of Russia there is a tomb where there's a dead body, and that this is not cultural, so they say. But at the same time, they quote some kind of Orthodox sectarian people, more or less, who right now, who have stated that, you know, and made prophecies about what would happen if Lenin would ever be taken out of the mausoleum. And one of these interesting prophets of the sectarians of the Orthodox Church is certain Matushka Alipi Kiseyova, and she said that the war will start the war will start on the apostles of Peter and Pavel in the November. That will happen in the year when the dead body is carried out. And another kind of old, venerated Orthodox sectarian monk, who is an important figure in this prophecy business of the Orthodox Church, stated that in April, when they will take the Bold One out of the mausoleum, the complete crackdown and crash of Moscow will happen, and many waters will rise, and very, very little of Moscow will remain. The sinners will still be swimming in the salty water for long, but no one will save them. They will all die. Therefore, I recommend those who work in Moscow just to leave just to leave when the April of that year hits, and he doesn't specify the year. Astrakhanskaya, Voronezhnaya, and Leningrad shall be also flooded. Everything around 30 kilometers from our capital shall be destroyed. The God wanted to do this, all of these terrible things already in 1999, but our prayers stopped him and asked him for more time. Now there is no time left. Only those who from the big cities will go and live in the countryside shall have a chance of surviving. It is useless to start building new homes in these villages, by the way. Live in those who exist there. There is no time left for this. Better buy a ready home. There will be a major starvation and epidemics of diseases. There will be no electricity, no water, no gas. Only those who can grow their own produce have a chance of surviving. China will rise on us with their 200 million army and will conquer all the Siberia up to the Ural Mountains. The Japanese shall rule in the Far East. The Russia shall be crushed, and Russia shall be split into pieces. A major, scary war will start. Russia shall remain in the borders of the time of the Ivan the Terrible. The great pre-Great Flood Saint Seraphim Savrovsky shall return. He will unite all the Slavic peoples and states and will bring with himself a true Tsar. There will be such a famine that those who had taken upon themselves the seal of the Antichrist shall eat the dead. And the most important part is pray and be ready to changely quit your lives so that you wouldn't live in sin, as there is no time left. And yeah, I'm sorry for this crappy translation, but he did this in very old kind of ancient Russian language. But yeah, right now there are beliefs that, if you take Lenin out, a major war shall start and terrible things shall happen. So, maybe that's the reason why Putin isn't that interested in removing Lenin's body from the tomb and actually, burying it and giving it a proper burial. Oh, well, and that's kind of crazy. But all jokes aside, I'd like to mention here in the end some small detail about our original guy, Pygorov's body. That Russian doctor which I mentioned at the beginning and who was also preserved. You see, compared to the corpse of Lenin, which undergoes thorough maintenance in the special underground clinic twice a week, the body of Pygorov rests untouched and unchanging. It is said that only dust has to be brushed off. It resides at room temperature in the glass-lid coffin, while Lenin's body is preserved at a constant low. And nobody knows about Pygorov's body, while Lenin is a major object of tourism. Take from it what you will, but that's to think about. For whom the people care more, and who's actually done some real good for the population. But hey, I might be completely wrong about all this situation, and maybe we'll get to a major war if Lenin is moved. I don't know. Would you take the chance? Not sure. Anyway, see you next time when we'll talk about the father of all nations, Stalin, and how he started his own cult while using Lenin's. And how all of this Soviet country got going into the most bloody period of its existence. And see you next time, товарищи. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to The Eastern Border. If you have any comments or specific details you'd like to know, you're welcome to leave it in the comment section on our site, theeasternborder.lv, and we'll rummage even to the western border to find you an answer. Like this podcast, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our RSS feed. Happiness is mandatory. Good reviews and donations feed the farmers of our kolkhos in the great motherland. The Eastern Border salutes you. This podcast is part of the Dark Myths Collective. Visit darkmyths.org for more shows like this one. The darkness awaits.